Okay, so now that we have a general description of utilitarian moral philosophy out of the way, in this video we're going to talk about what is probably the major split in the camp, and that is the difference between act or extreme utilitarianism on the one hand, and then rule or restricted utilitarianism on the other. All right, so act and rule utilitarians, obviously they're both utilitarians. They are both consequentialists. Now, sometimes act utilitarians accuse um, rule utilitarians of not really being utilitarians since they focus on aspects of following the rules. The term, blind rule follower might get thrown around a little bit and things like that. We're not going to get into the reasons for why some act utilitarians think that the very notion of rule utilitarianism is somewhat disingenuous. There's some literature on that. If you're interested in it, just shoot me an email and I can send you some links to some papers and things like that. So we'll start with act utilitarianism. So act utilitarians say that an act is right just in case it results in at least as much good as any available alternative action. So an act is right just in case it results in at least as much good as any available alternative. So if you're an act utilitarian, you are going to judge actions as right or wrong, acts as right or wrong on a case-by-case basis. You're going to compare individual actions against other individual actions, and you're just going to look at what actually happens. Some utilitarians want to explain actions as right or wrong in terms of not the actual consequences, but the expected or foreseeable consequences. But most utilitarians are not going to think of things that way. There's some problems with the idea that acts are right or wrong on the basis of the expected or foreseeable consequences. Now, but since act utilitarians will look at the consequences of individual actions, what they deny is that action types can be categorized as right or wrong simply in virtue of the kind of action that they are. If it's the consequences of particular actions which determine whether actions are right or wrong, then action types or kinds can't just be sort of generally categorized as right or wrong simply in virtue of the kind of action that they are. So, for example, an act utilitarian won't necessarily think that the question, is torture morally wrong, the right kind of question to ask. When we ask the question, is torture morally wrong, we are asking whether or not torture in general is wrong. Can we have kind of a general prohibition, if you will, against torturing? So to ask the question, is torture morally wrong, is to treat torture as an action type or kind that we can give a moral description to. An act utilitarian will say, no, this isn't really how we should think about our actions. Instead of asking a question like, is torture morally wrong, we should ask something like, is this particular instance of torture wrong? So suppose last week we tortured Bill, and Bill didn't have any useful information. So nothing good really came from torturing Bill. We caused Bill an extreme amount of pain and suffering, and we didn't prevent any other pain or suffering or harm, and nothing good came out of it. So on utilitarian grounds, sorry, Bill. Yeah, it was wrong to torture Bill. We tortured Bill. Bill didn't have any useful information, but we couldn't determine whether Bill had any useful information without torturing Bill in the first place. So yeah, sorry, Bill. But just because it was wrong to torture Bill last week, this week we've got Fred in a black bag. And what does the fact that it was wrong to torture Bill last week have to do with whether or not it's wrong to torture Fred this week? Here this week we've got a completely different person in a completely different set of circumstances, a completely different state of affairs. So we've got two unique situations, two particular situations, and then two particular token actions, two particular instances of torturing. So the fact that it was wrong to torture one person last week, that is largely irrelevant to whether or not it's wrong to torture a different person this week. Now, obviously, we're going to use past experience to make moral decisions. So act utilitarians don't deny that just as far as our moral reasoning goes, this is how we make decisions. So just psychologically, we are going to take into account what happened last week in making a decision about whether we should torture Fred this week. So but that's not a matter of determining whether the action itself is right or wrong. So there's a difference here between the kind of moral reasoning that we actually engage in and actually determining whether the action itself is right or wrong. Um, as far as our moral decision making is concerned, we don't have a choice but to rely on past experience and our reason, really. We simply don't have a choice in that matter. But remember again what utilitarianism is. Utilitarianism is not intended to be a moral decision-making procedure. It is intended to be a theory of what makes actions right or wrong. So again, if somebody objects to act utilitarianism on the grounds that, well, if actions are right or wrong on the basis of the actual consequences, and a lot of times those actions are not foreseeable or expected, then how are we supposed to make moral decisions? Yeah, that's a problem, but it's not a problem for the theory per se. So even if act utilitarianism doesn't really help us make moral decisions, that's not really a problem for the theory since it's not even intended to be a moral decision-making procedure. Some act utilitarians will go so far as to say, oh yeah, it really sucks as a moral decision-making procedure. But then again, you know, toy hammers aren't really good for actually repairing a roof. So if utilitarianism sucks as a moral decision-making procedure, then don't use it to make moral decisions. Maybe when we make moral decisions, we ought to think in a completely different kind of way. Maybe we should think like deontologists. Maybe we should make moral decisions like deontologists, but then just be utilitarians in terms of what actually determines whether the action is right or wrong. Okay? Now, rule utilitarians, whoops, let's try that again. Rule utilitarians, on the other hand, think that we can give descriptions of action types in general as being right or wrong. And there's a pretty good reason for that. Rule utilitarians will focus on whether or not certain types or kinds of actions tend to result in certain kinds of consequences. So when we think about torture, for example, a rule utilitarian will just ask us, okay, if you think about times where we have engaged in torture, does torture typically result in more good or more bad? So in the times where we've actually engaged in torture, does that usually result in greater net utility in the long run, or does it usually result in greater amounts of pain or misery or suffering and things like that? So if in general certain kinds of actions tend to produce certain kinds of consequences, then we can give a general description of whether or not this kind of action or type of action is in general right or wrong based on the kinds of consequences that the action tends to promote, or the kinds of consequences which tend to follow from this kind of action. Okay, so rule utilitarians will then do this. Rule utilitarians will focus on formulating social rules around general types of actions. So maybe as a society, we ought to have a general prohibition against torture. Why? Because, as we've seen based on past experience, uh, not much good tends to result from torture. Or we, as a society, we might have a general prohibition against, acts of vigilantism. So I know sometimes people think, oh, it would be so cool if there was a Batman. Um, I'm really glad there is no Batman. I'm really happy that there is no Batman. Why? Batman's sense of what's just might conflict with society at large, is conception of what is just. So for Batman to come after you, you don't necessarily need to do anything wrong. Batman just needs to think that you've done something wrong. So why as a society should we surrender our sense of social justice over to, a billionaire who's probably in need of some kind of family counseling or therapy based on past trauma? Why on earth would we surrender our sense of social justice or the justice system over to one individual whose ideas of what justice is might grossly conflict with our own? So we should be glad that acts of vigilantism are the kinds of things which are typically prohibited in our society. Now, so rule utilitarians will focus on these kinds of action types and then will formulate rules that are optimific. So a social rule is optimific if, when it is followed by a majority of members of society, it tends to produce greater net utility than any available alternative. Any available alternative what? Any available alternative set of rules. So a rule utilitarian will say that an act is right, first of all, if it's required by a social rule. That social rule itself is a member of a set of rules, and the acceptance of the set, meaning if a majority of members of society actually followed through with this set of rules, it would result in at least as much good as any available alternative. So rule utilitarianism is clearly a little more complex here than act utilitarianism is. Now, but as far as benefits to rule utilitarianism, what are some of the advantages here? So act utilitarianism suffers from some flaws that a rule utilitarian perspective may not necessarily be subject to. So, for example, act utilitarians might have a really difficult time explaining why things like keeping promises and fidelity in relationships and justice are morally important. So without sounding strange, think about infidelity for a moment and think about whether or not infidelity is harmful. So it clearly is true that infidelity has the opportunity to cause harm. So if you make a promise to somebody and then you break your promise to them, that is the kind of thing which has the potential to cause harm. But does breaking promises or not honoring your word or not honoring your contracts, does that always result in harm? No, it doesn't. Now, but if you're an act utilitarian and you're going to explain actions as right or wrong simply on the basis of whether or not anybody is actually harmed or whether or not there was a better alternative available, then even if you're an act utilitarian, you can't have a general prohibition against breaking promises, acting unjustly, or being infidelitous in relationships, either with respect to honoring promises or contracts or anything like that. So imagine you're on a first date with an act utilitarian. And I don't know why you would get into conversations about infidelity in relationships on a first date, but suppose you do. So you ask this act utilitarian, hey, how do you feel about infidelity? Is infidelity wrong? And this act utilitarian says, well, only if the other person finds out. I mean, if nobody finds out, who's being harmed here? So you think we're in a committed relationship. I'm giving the impression that we're in a committed relationship. I and the person I'm having an affair with are perfectly happy in our affair, and you're completely blissfully ignorant. So who's being harmed here? I guess nobody, actually. But if everything within you is saying, no, it still seems that that's wrong, even if nobody actually finds out about it. Yeah, then you have grounds to say, there's something deeply wrong here. Now, on the other hand, the rule utilitarian can say, well, even if it may be true that infidelity or breaking promises and things like that are only harmful under certain sets of circumstances, well, in those circumstances where they are harmful, they're pretty terribly harmful. So, yeah, how about we have a general prohibition against those kinds of things? So a rule utilitarian can accommodate these kinds of things. So a rule utilitarian can say this. A rule utilitarian can say, even if violating an optimific rule would result in better consequences in a unique set of circumstances. So suppose in a unique set of circumstances it would be better in some sort of immediate or expedient sense to break the rules. The rule utilitarian can still say, well, even in those kinds of circumstances, it doesn't follow that we should break the rules. Even in those kinds of circumstances, if the consequences of rule following are going to be greater in the long run than the consequences of rule breaking, then we do have a vested interest in following the rules, even if breaking the rules in a unique set of circumstances would result in a more immediate good or a more expedient good. Now, and to the extent that rule utilitarians might get accused of being blind rule followers, this charge doesn't really stick. For rule utilitarians, the value of rule following is in the consequences of doing so. So if for some reason the rules just aren't working for us anymore, then by all means, we should formulate a new set of rules, or we should amend the social rules that we actually have. So there's nothing in rule utilitarianism which says that the rules themselves are set in stone. And there's nothing in rule utilitarianism which says that the rules are absolute or universal. So rule utilitarians do say things which are more resonant with certain forms of deontology than act utilitarians do. But it doesn't follow from that that rule utilitarianism is actually just a form of deontology. So for deontologists, the importance of rule following is not necessarily with the consequences of doing so. Deontologists focus on whether or not the rules themselves are consistent. So do we have rules that can be consistently followed by rational beings in society? If the answer to that question is yes, then on deontological grounds, you've got good rules. But on rule utilitarian grounds, the rules themselves, the consequences of rule following still need to be better. So rule utilitarians are still consequentialists, despite the fact that they say things that sound a little more like deontology. So rule utilitarianism is certainly closer to certain forms of deontology than forms of act utilitarianism are, but then again, New York is closer to London than Chicago is. So, yeah, New York is closer to London than Chicago is, yet there's still an entire ocean between New York and London. Well, think of rule utilitarianism and deontology that way. So they do get closer together, but they're still very, very, very different. Okay, now, the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is John Stuart Mill's understanding of what we could call secondary moral principles. So John Stuart Mill, as a utilitarian, is predominantly an act utilitarian, but he does say things which also resonate with rule utilitarians. And his notion of secondary moral principles is one of those things. So when John Stuart Mill talks about things like justice and promise keeping and honoring people's rights and respecting individual autonomy, he thinks all of these things in the long run are dependent upon happiness. They're kind of subservient to happiness. So why is it that in society respect for rights and respect for individual autonomy and promise keeping, honoring our word, honoring our contracts and the like, why are these things morally important? Well, Mill thinks that these things are morally important because as individuals, we make these things further conditions of our happiness. So since I want other individuals in society to keep their promises towards me, I want my autonomy respected. I want my rights respected. So Mill thinks that a right is something that I, as an individual, have a legitimate claim against society. So if I have a right to something, that means I have a claim against other members of society that they ought to respect that. So for example, a lot of times my being left alone, my not being feared with in my daily activities, my not being, you know, spied upon by the government, my privacy not being invaded. These things are conditions of my happiness. I want to live my life as I see fit. I want to be able to make decisions about what's in my best interest. I want to be able to interact with other members of society freely. And to the extent that I am under the impression that these kinds of things are being infringed upon, this affects my happiness. So Mill says anything that we then make an element of our happiness is desirable for its own sake. So what happens is our happiness gets interwoven with our autonomy, with our demand for respect, our demand for freedom and liberty, our demand that other individuals keep their promises, our demands to live in a just and harmonious society. So, since happiness for John Stuart Mill is the only thing that is fundamentally good or desirable, to the extent that we make other kinds of secondary moral principles conditions of our happiness, or make these things elements of our happiness, anything, if happiness is fundamentally good, anything which is then an element of my happiness is then going to be fundamentally good as well. And since as individuals, there are certain kinds of things that almost universally we desire. We desire freedom. We desire justice. We desire, our rights being respected. These things are so interwoven with our happiness that they are largely indistinguishable from our happiness. So even though they are theoretically distinguishable, so we should never sacrifice happiness for justice. If justice were not at all a condition of our happiness, even though it is, but if theoretically justice had nothing to do with our happiness, we shouldn't sacrifice happiness for the sake of justice. Or if we actually as a species didn't care about promise keeping, then of course, if breaking promises is going to make us happier in the long run, then yeah, let's break our promises. So even though for Mill, happiness is the only thing that is universally desirable and fundamentally good, we can still incorporate these other kinds of secondary things to the extent that they are elements or conditions of our further happiness. Okay, so that will wrap up our short discussion of utilitarianism here, and then in the next series of videos we will be talking about deontology.